Welcome. Before we begin tonight's deep dive into one of the most chilling stories from 1845 New Orleans, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And make sure to subscribe, because uncovering real historical cases like this takes a tremendous amount of research, digging through old records, forgotten testimonies, and hidden archives. Tonight, we're exploring the terrifying rise and sudden collapse of a plantation, all triggered by one boy whose presence changed everything. The boy arrived on the plantation in the summer of 1845 with no warning, no name anyone could agree on, and no clear explanation of where he had come from. Some said he was purchased quietly during a late-night transaction at the docks, brought in on a small skiff that avoided the main port. Others swore they saw him already standing at the edge of the cane fields before the sun rose, staring toward the main house, as if he had been there for years. What made his arrival unsettling wasn't just the silence that followed him, but the way he carried himself, not frightened like a child torn from familiar ground, not curious the way most children would be in a new place, but calm, almost too calm, as if he already understood the land he was stepping onto. The enslaved workers who saw him first kept their distance, confused by the boy's stillness. He didn't cry, didn't cling to anyone, didn't show any of the frantic fear that children in his situation usually did. Instead, he simply looked around with dark, steady eyes, observing everyone as though he were the one deciding who belonged there. Some of the older workers whispered that it wasn't natural for a boy that young to stand so firmly, so quietly, as if he had already lived a lifetime. When the overseer asked him his name, the boy didn't speak. He only raised his chin slightly, which made the overseer uncomfortable enough to step back. From that moment, people began saying the boy had a way of looking through you, something that made even grown men clear their throats and look away. Word spread fast across the quarters that the new child wasn't ordinary, though no one could explain why they felt that way. There was nothing visibly strange about him, no injuries, no markings, no signs of possession, nothing that would invite superstition. Yet everyone felt a pressure in their chest when he stood near. The plantation owner pretended not to notice the boy's unsettling presence, but even he hesitated the first time he saw him standing alone under the gallery, completely still despite the sweltering heat. The boy's clothes were too clean, too well fitted for someone supposedly brought in from a chaotic purchase. His appearance felt intentional, as if his arrival had been planned long before anyone on the plantation learned about him. Some believed he belonged to another plantation and had been smuggled or abandoned. Others believed he had been born in New Orleans and sold secretly. But none of the theories explained why no merchant, no record, no bill of sale mentioned a child his age during that season. The boy was assigned to stay near the main house, fetching water or carrying small items, but he rarely needed instructions. He seemed to anticipate tasks before they were spoken. If someone reached for a tool, he would already be handing it to them. If a pot needed water, he would appear with the bucket moments before being told. This strange awareness unsettled people more than anything else. It felt less like obedience and more like foresight. One afternoon, when the cook asked him where he came from, the boy finally spoke, but only one sentence. He said, "I was brought here because it has begun." No one understood what he meant, and when they asked him to explain, he didn't respond again. That single sentence spread across the property like a cold wind. Workers repeated it, trying to interpret it, and the more they said it aloud, the more it felt like a warning instead of a simple remark. Within days, small but eerie incidents began to occur, not large enough to cause alarm, but strange enough to make people look at the boy differently. A lantern fell from a hook without reason. A row of cane wilted in a perfect line, despite being watered. A horse refused to go near the boy even when coaxed. Nothing dangerous, but everything unusual. And each time someone looked back at the boy, after one of these events, he was already watching them, calm and unreadable, as if he had been waiting. From the moment he arrived, the plantation felt different, heavier, quieter, as though holding its breath. And whether anyone admitted it or not, the entire place knew one truth. The boy had not simply arrived. He had entered the plantation like a storm enters a field, silently at first, but with a power no one recognized until it was too late. From the very first week, the enslaved workers sensed something deeply wrong about the boy's presence, though none of them could explain it in plain words. It wasn't that he misbehaved or caused trouble, or even that he spoke harshly. In fact, he barely spoke at all. What disturbed people was the feeling that followed him wherever he went, a quiet tension that settled over conversations and made even the most seasoned field hands fall silent when he walked past. It was as if the air around him carried its own chill, even in the sweltering New Orleans heat. The quarters, which were normally filled with murmured laughter, whispered stories, and the comfort of shared struggle changed after the boy's arrival. People who used to gather together at night found themselves drifting into smaller groups, constantly glancing toward the shadows as though expecting him to appear. Mothers kept their children closer. Men who never showed fear found excuses to sit facing the doorway. No one wanted to admit out loud that the boy frightened them, but everyone felt the same unease. The first clear sign of division happened only days after he arrived. Two women who had worked side by side for years got into their first heated argument. At first it seemed random, a misunderstanding over washing water, but the argument escalated so quickly and so fiercely that others had to pull them apart. Later, each woman swore the other had spoken words she would never use. Cruel words that felt forced into their minds, and both, without meaning to, glanced in the direction of the main house, where the boy stood watching silently from the steps. Whispers began that night. Some claimed the boy's eyes glowed in the dark. Others insisted they heard him walking outside their doors long after he had been put to sleep in the storage room near the house. A few workers were so convinced of these sightings that they stopped sleeping altogether, sitting up against the walls with their knees pulled to their chests. When morning came, no one wanted to admit they were afraid of a child, so they blamed the long workdays or the heat, but their trembling hands told the truth. One event pushed the fear even deeper. Two men were repairing a fence in the lower field when the boy wandered by carrying a bucket of scraps from the kitchen. The men kept their distance, but as he passed, both felt a powerful sense of dread wash over them, sudden and overwhelming. One of the men dropped the hammer he was holding, swearing he felt an unseen hand push against his shoulder. The other man felt nauseous, as if the ground itself tilted beneath him. They didn't say anything until the boy walked far enough away, and then the two exchanged terrified glances. each knowing the other had felt the same thing. The field workers became divided into two camps, those who believed the boy brought misfortune, and those who said fear itself was spreading like a sickness. This argument created tension where there had never been any. Workers who had survived storms, beatings, and countless hardships were suddenly turning on each other over a child who didn't speak more than a word a day. The boy's silence, in a way, spoke louder than any accusation. Even the overseers began to notice the fractured atmosphere. Productivity dropped, coordination among teams broke down, and workers refused to take certain paths or enter certain sheds after dusk, claiming the boy had been there recently. Some said tools went missing when he walked by. Others believed animals reacted to him in ways that were not natural. A mule nearly broke its own harness trying to run from him. Dogs barked at walls whenever he was near. Chickens scattered the moment he stepped into the yard, as though sensing a predator they couldn't see. What unsettled everyone most was how the boy behaved in the face of all this fear. He was not angry, not confused, not nervous. He remained calm, too calm. If two people were arguing, he would stand nearby and simply watch until they noticed him. The instant their eyes met his, the fight would stop, not because they resolved anything, but because they felt suddenly drained of energy, like their anger had been pulled out of them. This only made suspicion worse. People began avoiding him in daylight and praying against him at night. A few workers tried to convince the overseer that the boy should be moved to another part of the property, but the overseer brushed it off. He didn't believe in superstition, and he certainly didn't take orders from people he considered beneath him. But even he stopped meeting the boy's gaze directly after an uncomfortable encounter where he felt, for a moment, as though the child somehow knew every thought in his head. By the end of the second week, the plantation was split down the middle. Fear lived in one half, denial in the other. Old alliances broke, old routines shattered, and where there had once been a fragile unity forged by shared suffering, there was now a silent, gnawing distrust, all of it circling around one quiet boy who walked through the fields, as if he had always belonged to the shadows. It started with the livestock, small signs at first, strange enough to notice, but not alarming enough for anyone to take immediate action. A mule that had been perfectly healthy the night before was suddenly unable to stand, its legs trembling as if it had run for miles. A cow that had been producing milk steadily for years went dry overnight. The workers blamed the heat, the water, even sickness in the air. But none of the animals showed any signs of disease. They just weakened, one by one, as though something invisible was draining the life out of them. The first real shock came when a prized horse collapsed in the middle of the yard. The overseer had been grooming it, preparing it for a delivery to the neighboring plantation. The horse suddenly reared back, eyes wide, nostrils flaring as though it smelled a predator no one else could sense. It kicked against empty air, then fell with such force that the ground seemed to tremble. As dust settled, everyone saw it. The boy was standing a short distance away, watching with that same unsettling calmness he always had. He didn't flinch or panic. He simply stared, as if he had expected the moment. No one said anything out loud, but the way the workers exchanged glances said everything. The horse's collapse wasn't random, it wasn't normal, and it wasn't the last. Within a week, entire rows of sugarcane began to wilt without explanation. They didn't dry out like they would during drought. They sagged, as if the strength had been sucked out of them all at once. The overseer tested the soil, checked the irrigation, ordered workers to dig up the roots. Everything appeared normal. Still, each morning brought new patches of dying cane, almost in a pattern, as if something was moving through the fields at night. And every time a worker discovered a freshly wilted row, the boy was somewhere nearby, watching silently from the edge of the field. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the workers, as if he was waiting for their reaction. Some refused to step closer if they noticed him. Others walked the long way around the field just to avoid passing him. No one dared question him. A child should have looked frightened in such a tense environment, but he didn't. The fear belonged to everyone else. One evening, the worst sign yet appeared. A group of men went out to gather tools left near the shed, only to find the entire chicken yard silent. Chickens usually clucked softly through the night, restless and alert. But that night, there was no sound at all. When they approached, they found the entire yard empty, not a feather, not a footprint, not a droplet of blood. It looked as though every chicken had simply vanished into thin air. As the men stood frozen in confusion, the wind shifted, and they heard footsteps behind them. They turned to see the boy walking slowly between the sheds, the moonlight outlining his small frame. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just moving with that same quiet certainty he always had. And when he passed the chicken yard, the air grew cold enough that the men could see their breath. None of them ever spoke of that moment aloud, but afterwards they refused to work near that area after sunset, claiming the silence itself felt dangerous. The plantation owner grew anxious when he saw the financial threat. Livestock dying, crops failing, workers terrified, it all pointed to ruin. But he couldn't point the blame at disease or weather. Whatever was happening didn't follow natural patterns. It happened too quickly, too cleanly, too deliberately. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, all of it seemed to follow the boy like a shadow. What made the situation even more disturbing was that the boy never appeared confused, never looked upset, never showed signs of a child reacting to chaos. He moved through the dying fields as though they meant nothing to him. He walked by fallen animals without a trace of fear, sympathy, or curiosity. His expression never changed. The workers whispered that the land itself was reacting to him, that whatever he carried with him was stronger than the earth's ability to resist. Some argued that he was cursed. Others believed he wasn't a child at all, but something wearing the form of one. And a few, terrified and trembling, warned that the plantation's collapse had only just begun. Every dying crop, every silent night, every frightened animal pointed to one terrifying truth. The boy didn't just bring disaster. Disaster formed around him, as though following an invisible command no one understood. The owner had never been a man easily shaken. He'd survived storms that ruined half the parish, financial panics that destroyed his neighbors, even a fever epidemic that wiped out entire households. But something about the boy unsettled him in a way he couldn't put into words. At first, he dismissed the workers' whispers as superstition born from exhaustion. Children didn't curse land. Children didn't kill crops. Children didn't make animals cower. But late at night, sitting alone in his study with the oil lamp flickering low, he found himself replaying the strange moments he'd witnessed. moments he had tried to ignore. The way the boy always seemed to appear without footsteps. The way he would turn his head a fraction of a second before someone called his name, as if he already knew who was approaching. The way his eyes lingered a little too long on the fields that were failing. The way the air felt heavier whenever the child entered a room. And worst of all, the way the boy never looked afraid. Not once. Children in that world lived in constant fear, fear of punishment, fear of separation, fear of the harshness of the land. Yet this boy showed nothing, no trembling, no hesitation, no tears. His silence wasn't the silence of trauma. It was the silence of someone watching everything with odd, steady understanding. And that chilled the owner more than he cared to admit. As the plantation's troubles grew, so did the owner's paranoia. He began waking up at night, convinced he'd heard footsteps outside his door. Sometimes he swore the steps stopped right at the threshold, pausing just long enough to make his pulse spike. When he opened the door, no one was there, but the hall felt colder. On more than one occasion, he saw the boy standing at the bottom of the staircase at dawn, staring up as if waiting for him. He started avoiding the child entirely. If he saw the boy near the house, he pretended to be busy. If he saw him in the yard, he took a different path. He began giving orders through the overseer rather than directly. Anything to limit the eerie tension he felt whenever the child's eyes landed on him. The turning point came one muggy afternoon when the owner found the boy in the main parlor, a place he had explicitly forbidden children to enter. The boy stood in the exact center of the room, perfectly still, looking up at a large, framed portrait of the owner's late wife. The curtains were drawn, and a greenish light leaked around the edges, giving the room an unnatural hue. The owner froze in the doorway. The boy didn't turn around. He didn't flinch. He simply kept staring at the portrait, his head tilted slightly, as though studying something no one else could see. After several tense seconds, he finally spoke in a low, calm voice. She didn't like this house either. That sentence shattered whatever stability the owner had left. His breath caught. His hands shook. His heart hammered wildly. The child couldn't have known anything about his wife, her dislike of the plantation, her wish to move back to New Orleans, the way she had begged him to leave the property behind. Those were secrets the owner had never shared with anyone, not even family. He grabbed the boy by the arm, demanding to know who told him such things, but the boy simply turned and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. There was no fear in them, no apology, just quiet certainty. The owner released him instantly, stepping back as though burned. From that moment on, his paranoia spiraled. He ordered locks added to his doors. He slept with a pistol under his pillow. He dismissed workers for small mistakes, convinced they were plotting something. He accused the overseer of hiding information. He refused to walk the grounds alone. Every shadow looked like the boy. Every sound felt like a warning. The boy's silent presence seemed to drain the owner's sanity like water leaking through cracked stone. Even the workers noticed the shift, whispering that the master's mind was fraying. Some claimed they saw him talking to himself. Others said he paced the property for hours, muttering about curses and omens. And through it all, the boy remained calm, distant, watching the owner's unraveling with the same quiet expression, as if he had expected it, maybe even intended it, from the moment he stepped onto the plantation. By the end of the month, The owner was no longer the powerful figure he once was. He had become a haunted man, terrified of a child who never raised a hand against him, never threatened him, never spoke more than a few words. Yet somehow, without touching him, the boy had become the force that ruled his every waking and sleeping moment, the silent shadow standing at the center of his collapsing world. It was on a thick, suffocating night that the first tragedy struck inside the main house, a night so heavy with humidity that even the walls seemed to sweat. The workers had long since retreated to their quarters, the overseer to his room, and the owner to his study. The candles were burning low, and the cicadas outside were louder than usual, as if warning of something approaching. Yet inside the house, everything felt still, unnaturally still, like the quiet before a storm breaks open. The boy had been told to sleep in the small storage space near the kitchen, but he wasn't there when the cook checked before turning in. No one saw him wander off. No doors creaked. No floorboards groaned under his bare feet. He simply slipped away from where he was supposed to be and appeared where no one expected him, in the upstairs hallway, outside the owner's sleeping son's room. The son, barely 12, had been ill for weeks. Not fatally ill, just weak with fever. The family doctor insisted he would recover. But that night, the child woke suddenly, sitting upright in his bed, as if pulled from sleep by an unseen hand. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as though searching for something in the shadows. Then he began to scream, not in pain, but in pure, animal terror. The scream tore through the house. The cook heard it first, then the overseer jolted awake, then workers in the nearby yard lifted their heads. The owner sprinted up the stairs, heart pounding, feeling the floor shake beneath his frantic steps. He burst through the door and froze. His son was thrashing on the bed, eyes wild, pointing toward the corner of the room. There was nothing there, nothing but darkness. Yet the boy kept shrieking, insisting someone was standing in the shadows. The owner rushed to him, shaking him gently, telling him he was safe. But the boy's cries only grew louder, more desperate. Then, in an instant that made the hair on the owner's arms rise, the screaming stopped. The sickly child collapsed backward onto the pillow, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as though he were staring at something no one else could see. Then his eyes rolled back, his body convulsed once, and he went still. The owner's own cry echoed through the house as he shook his son's limp body, begging him to breathe. By the time the doctor was fetched, the child was gone. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the sudden death itself. It was what the overseer saw moments later. As he ran down the hallway to assist the owner, he caught sight of the mysterious boy standing calmly at the end of the corridor, half hidden in the darkness. The child's posture was relaxed, almost casual. He wasn't frightened by the commotion. He wasn't confused. He wasn't even curious. He simply watched, hands at his sides, with those dark, unreadable eyes. The overseer shouted at him, demanding to know why he was out of bed, but the boy said nothing. He only tilted his head, as if listening to something distant, something only he could hear. Then, without rushing, without making a sound, he turned and slipped back into the shadows, disappearing down the stairs before the overseer could reach him. When the workers later gathered outside, whispering about the tragedy, several claimed they heard the boy humming softly behind the kitchen. A strange tune, slow and unsettling, one no one recognized. But whenever they approached, the humming stopped, and the boy looked up with that same calm expression, as if daring them to accuse him. None of them did. Fear had stitched their throats shut. The death of the owner's son marked the beginning of the house's true collapse. The owner became unhinged, certain the plague on his property was connected to the quiet child he never should have brought home. The workers refused to sleep, keeping lanterns lit through the night. The overseer grew restless, snapping at everyone around him, his nerves frayed to threads. But the boy, he moved through the chaos untouched, unbothered, as if the tragedy unfolding was merely a story he had always known would be told. No one could explain how a boy who barely spoke, barely interacted, and barely showed emotion could be at the center of such darkness. Yet everyone felt the same thing deep in their bones. The tragedy in the main house wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the end. It was the first crack in the foundation of a world that would soon crumble completely, a silent warning that whatever had arrived in 1845 was far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The rumors spread long before anyone could trace where they started, and every version seemed to grow darker as it traveled from one plantation to the next. Some said the boy carried a curse that followed him like a shadow, a quiet force that slipped under doors and into bedrooms the moment someone whispered his name. Others believed he wasn't cursed at all but chosen, marked by something older and more powerful than anyone understood. In the quarters, people lowered their voices whenever he passed, not out of hatred, but out of fear that even mentioning him too casually might invite misfortune into their own homes. What made it worse was that strange incidents truly did begin to follow wherever he went. Animals reacting to him, like they sensed something humans couldn't. Lamps flickering out when he entered a room, and the sudden tightening of the air, as if the world itself paused to watch him. The adults tried to make sense of it, but the more they searched for explanations, the more tangled the mystery became, because nothing tied these incidents together except the boy himself, and even he couldn't understand why things changed when he was near. The enslaved workers whispered that the plantation's collapse didn't begin with a single event, but with a feeling, a heaviness settling across the land the moment the boy's mother brought him there. Supervisors grew uneasy, noticing the workers glancing over their shoulders as though expecting something unseen. They started blaming the boy for accidents he had nothing to do with, simply because it was easier than admitting the truth. No one had any explanation at all. Some said he had a presence that stirred old stories elders used to tell about spirits roaming the swamps, choosing certain children as messengers. No one dared speak that theory openly, because it felt too close to inviting the supernatural into everyday life. Yet the fear persisted and deepened, especially when night fell and silence grew sharp enough to make the smallest sound feel threatening. Families on nearby properties began repeating their own sightings. Moments when they claimed the boy's silhouette appeared near their fences, even though he had never left his home, or the unsettling way their sleep was interrupted by dreams they insisted weren't dreams at all. Slave catchers and overseers dismissed these accounts as imagination fueled by fear. But even they couldn't deny the atmosphere shifting whenever the boy came into view. He didn't speak much, and maybe that silence made him more unsettling, because people filled the empty space around him with stories, myths, and suspicions. Over time, those whispers created a reputation larger than the child himself, turning him into a symbol of something unexplainable long before he was old enough to understand the weight of it. By the time the plantation's troubles escalated, the boy's name had become something people refused to say at night. Workers claimed he saw things they couldn't see, shadows that moved against the direction of the lantern light, shapes hovering in doorways that vanished when adults turned to look. Whether these claims were true or born from fear didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that people believed them, and belief alone was strong enough to shift behavior, divide families, and push the plantation into a slow, inevitable unraveling. Even those who cared about the boy started keeping distance not out of cruelty, but out of survival, as though proximity to him invited consequences no one wanted to face. The mystery deepened when the boy himself began sensing changes, cold spots in warm rooms, the odd sensation that someone was standing behind him when no one was there, and the way certain places on the plantation made the hairs on his arms rise without warning. He tried to explain what he felt, but adults dismissed him, insisting he was just a child with imagination. Yet every time they ignored his warnings, something unusual followed. It wasn't dramatic or violent, but small enough to unsettle anyone paying attention: tools disappearing, footsteps heard in empty rooms, or nights where the entire plantation seemed to hold its breath. Over time, these incidents accumulated until even the skeptics started looking over their shoulders. By then, the whispers had become a force of their own, powerful enough to shape reality. People began interpreting normal events as signs connected to the boy, and fear turned into certainty. The belief that he carried something unexplainable became as dangerous as anything actually happening around him. And in that belief, the plantation crossed a line it could never return from, setting the stage for the eventual collapse that would be remembered for years. People first dismissed the change in the boy's behavior as nothing more than the natural quietness of a child who had already lived through too many hardships. But gradually it became clear that something deeper was happening inside him, something he couldn't put into words. He began waking in the middle of the night, eyes wide open, breathing fast, yet unable to explain what he had seen. He would sit upright for hours, staring at corners where there was nothing visible, as if waiting for something only he could sense. Those who shared the quarters with him said they sometimes found him standing near doorways before dawn, silent and still, as though listening to voices they couldn't hear. At first, they tried comforting him, but the more they saw, the more they realized his fear didn't behave like a normal child's fear. It wasn't sudden or loud. It was heavy, steady, and strangely aware, like he expected each day to bring something darker than the last. He also stopped playing the small games children used to distract themselves from the harshness of plantation life. Instead, he preferred to sit alone, carving small marks into wood or drawing shapes in the dirt that made no sense to the adults who saw them. These symbols weren't random, they repeated, sometimes in patterns, as though he were trying to recreate something he had witnessed, but didn't understand. Workers who noticed the carvings whispered among themselves, wondering if the boy was being guided by something beyond human comprehension. Some feared he was slipping into madness, but others believed the opposite, that he was becoming more in tune with whatever had been haunting the plantation long before he arrived. As nights grew longer and colder, he began recounting moments that made the adults uneasy. He spoke of hearing footsteps outside the quarters when no one was there, of seeing figures walk between the trees, even on nights with no moonlight, and of feeling a breath on the back of his neck, though he slept surrounded by others. These experiences weren't dreams. He insisted he was awake each time. The older women tried to soothe him with prayers and whispered blessings, but each morning, his eyes looked more tired, more distant, as though sleep itself had become dangerous territory for him. What unsettled people most was how the boy's instincts sharpened. He seemed to know when an argument was about to break out before any words were exchanged. He avoided certain paths on the plantation as if something invisible waited there. When animals grew restless or sudden cold winds swept through the fields, he reacted before anyone else, turning his head sharply toward places no one else had sensed. It was as though his mind had tuned itself to signals others were blind to. At first, the adults tried to dismiss these moments as coincidences, but the consistency of his reactions made it impossible to ignore. The workers began watching him closely, not out of curiosity, but out of a growing belief that whatever was affecting him might be trying to reach others as well. The strongest sign that something unnatural was happening inside him came one evening when he froze in the middle of a conversation, his eyes drifting toward the main house. He whispered that someone had died inside, even though no one had heard a sound. Minutes later, a scream echoed from the house, confirming exactly what he had sensed. After that night, no one doubted the boy anymore. The workers grew fearful of his abilities, unsure whether he was cursed, blessed, or simply trapped between two worlds. He didn't ask for these visions, nor did he understand them. Each new sensation frightened him more than anyone else, but he carried them quietly, too afraid to speak and too powerless to control them. As days passed, the changes became more pronounced. He ate less, slept less, and seemed lost in thoughts that belonged to someone far older than him. It was as if the weight of the plantation's secrets had begun settling on his small shoulders, pushing him into a kind of awareness no child should ever have to bear. And while no one could explain what was happening, everyone knew one thing with chilling certainty. The boy was no longer just a witness to the plantation's darkness. He was becoming a part of it, connected to its tragedies in ways that defied logic, reason, and nature itself. The chain of misfortune didn't stop with animals, crops, or the mysterious behavior of the boy. It soon extended to the families on the plantation in ways that no one could explain. At first, it was subtle. Minor accidents, misplaced tools, or small arguments that erupted for no apparent reason. But these small disturbances quickly escalated into events that could not be ignored. A family that had lived on the plantation for generations suddenly found their eldest daughter falling gravely ill, despite the absence of any disease in the surrounding area. Another family reported fires breaking out inexplicably in the kitchens, damaging food stores and creating chaos that seemed orchestrated rather than accidental. Each incident, when examined individually, could have been dismissed as bad luck, but the pattern was unmistakable, and every trace seemed to converge on the presence of the boy. What made the situation even more frightening was how the misfortune appeared to follow the boy wherever he went. If he wandered near a barn, the roof would leak in a new spot by the next morning. If he spent time in a particular field, the crops there would wilt overnight. If he entered the main house, a vase might shatter or a candle tip over, leaving small scorch marks in otherwise untouched furniture. Workers started keeping their distance, whispering that the boy's very footsteps carried some unseen influence. Even the owner, a man used to controlling his property and its inhabitants, began to realize that conventional explanations, weather, negligence, or disease, could not account for the sequence of disasters unfolding around him. Neighbors across the river began noticing a similar pattern. Families who had once worked in cooperation with the plantation saw their livestock behaving erratically after crossing paths with the boy, or noticed strange illnesses afflicting them in subtle ways. The boy's reputation began to spread, even though few had seen him directly. Those who did speak of him described the same unsettling calmness, the same quiet eyes that seemed to penetrate into the very essence of anyone who encountered him. Fear grew quickly, because no one could predict where or when the next incident would occur. The mere presence of the boy, it seemed, was enough to unbalance life in ways that defied reason. Workers reported incidents that made them question reality itself. Tools left in one place would turn up in another, never far from where the boy had been standing. Water would appear tainted, though it had been clean the day before. Fires would flare without explanation, sometimes in the middle of the night, waking families to find their homes half smoldering. Even animals that had once been docile became skittish or aggressive when he approached, their reactions almost as though they recognized a threat invisible to human eyes. Some of the older workers whispered that the boy carried with him a presence that was neither fully living nor fully dead, a tension between worlds that humans could neither see nor control. Despite all this, the boy remained outwardly unaffected by the chaos around him. He did not laugh, cry, or show any expression of guilt or surprise. When confronted about a broken tool or a toppled basket, he would only stare, quiet and composed, as though he understood the consequences better than anyone else. This only deepened the workers' fear and the owner's growing paranoia. The plantation, once a place of labor and routine, had become a landscape of anxiety, with every shadow holding a potential calamity and every unexplained sound a possible omen. The families themselves began to fracture under the pressure. Parents argued over what could be done to stop the disasters, blaming each other, and, quietly, blaming the boy. Marriages grew strained. Siblings became suspicious of one another, and workers avoided the main house whenever possible. Superstition, fear, and helplessness intertwined, creating an atmosphere thick with dread. Children were kept indoors, crops were harvested early out of panic, and animals were moved constantly in attempts to avoid the boy's influence. But no strategy worked. Wherever he went, something strange seemed to follow. By the time the boy reached the fields at dawn, the property had become a haunted place of perpetual tension. Every family was aware that life could change in a moment, that no matter how careful they were, misfortune might strike again. Yet, despite the chaos, no adult dared confront him directly for fear of provoking something far worse. The boy, quiet and still, had become the epicenter of inexplicable calamity, a living catalyst for events that could not be rationalized, only endured. In that sense, the collapse of the plantation was already in motion, unfolding slowly, inexorably, as if the boy's silent presence had triggered a chain reaction that could not be stopped.